Tracy. The poor maid knelt on the cold marble floor of the grand estate in Minerva Park, her knees pressed against stone that never seemed to warm, no matter how long she worked. The morning air in Columbus, Ohio, carried the scent of wet grass and distant wood smoke, slipping through the half-open kitchen window as she scrubbed the baseboards with a bristled brush that had worn thin from months of use. Her hands moved in steady circles, left to right, dip into the bucket, wring the cloth, repeat. A rhythm she had learned to perform without thinking. She was a maid, 23 years old, with calloused palms and a back that ached by midday, invisible to most who passed through these halls. The estate belonged to Richard, a young man whose wealth announced itself in every corner. The imported Italian tiles beneath her knees, the crystal chandeliers that caught morning light and scattered it like diamonds across the walls, the mahogany staircase that curved upward like a question mark. Tracy had polished every inch of this house, knew every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn stain on the Persian rugs, yet she had never sat in any of the velvet chairs or touched the gold-rimmed china except to wash it. Richard's wedding was 3 weeks away, and the house buzzed with preparation. Tailors arriving with garment bags, florists carrying armfuls of white roses, caterers tasting sauces in the kitchen. Tracy worked through her tasks without complaint. She scrubbed the floors before sunrise, aired the heavy curtains that smelled of dust and old perfume, beat the rugs until her arms trembled. Polished silver until she could see her tired face reflected in spoons. She had arrived at this house 4 years ago, 16 years old, carrying only a cloth bag with 2 dresses and a photograph of her mother, who had kissed her forehead and whispered, "Be good, work hard, send money when you can." Her mother's lungs were weak, her younger brothers thin and hungry, and Tracy had learned early that survival meant silence, gratitude, and never asking for more than what was given. Richard treated her with a kindness that surprised her. He learned her name within a week, thanked her when she brought him tea, once gave her an extra day's wages when her brother fell ill. She had thought, in quiet moments, while folding his shirts or arranging flowers in his study, that good men still existed in this world, that wealth did not always corrupt, that perhaps her hard work would be rewarded with stability, with enough money to bring her family out of the cramped apartment where mold grew in the corners and the heat never worked in winter. But beneath her gratitude, Tracy carried a secret heaviness, a feeling she could not name, an intuition that something in this house was not as it appeared, that the laughter echoing through the halls was too bright, too brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. Before we continue with this story, please subscribe to this channel and like this video so more people can hear this tale. Now, let us continue. Richard's estate sprawled across 3 acres of manicured lawn, with 8 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a library lined with leather-bound books he never read, and a garage housing 2 cars that gleamed like polished obsidian. The kitchen had marble countertops shipped from quarries in Vermont, a wine cellar stocked with bottles older than Tracy, and a dining room table that could seat 20 guests beneath a chandelier that cost more than her mother would earn in 10 lifetimes. Every surface whispered wealth. The silk curtains, the oil paintings in gilded frames, the orchids that arrived weekly from a florist in downtown Columbus. Tracy had grown up in a 2-room apartment on the east side of the city, where her father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to work double shifts at a laundry service that left her hands raw and red. Tracy's brothers, 9 and 11, ate 1 meal a day if they were lucky, and she had learned to stretch a single chicken into 3 dinners, to darn socks until there was more thread than fabric, to walk 2 miles instead of taking the bus to save $1. She had been 14 when her mother's cough started, a wet rattle that never went away, and 16 when a neighbor told her about a wealthy family in Minerva Park looking for a maid. She had arrived at Richard's door on a gray October morning, wearing a dress her mother had sewn from old curtains, carrying the cloth bag and a letter of recommendation from a church pastor, who barely knew her. Richard had opened the door himself, unusual for a man of his status, and studied her with eyes that seemed to see past the nervousness, the hunger, the desperation. "Can you work hard?" he had asked. "Yes, sir," she had replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "Then you're hired," he said, and she had nearly wept with relief. Her days began at 5 in the morning and ended after sunset. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees until her fingers wrinkled like raisins, carried baskets of laundry up and down stairs until her calves burned, ironed shirts in a stifling room where sweat dripped down her spine, prepared meals she would never taste, and fell into her narrow bed in the attic room, too exhausted to dream. Her knees bore permanent bruises, her lower back ached with a dull throb that never fully disappeared, and her hands developed calluses so thick she could barely feel the texture of fabric anymore. But she never complained. Complaining was a luxury for those who had choices, and Tracy had learned that silence was survival, that gratitude kept you employed, that invisibility was safer than being noticed. She existed in the margins of Richard's life, a shadow that moved through rooms, a pair of hands that kept his world clean and ordered, a presence so unremarkable that guests often spoke freely in front of her, as if she were a piece of furniture incapable of hearing or understanding. There was a line in this house, invisible but absolute, separating those who owned from those who served, those who lounged on sofas from those who scrubbed them, those whose lives mattered from those who made those lives possible. Tracy understood this line, respected it, never tried to cross it. Her goal was simple: work hard, send money home, keep her mother alive, get her brothers through school, and maybe, if she was lucky and careful and invisible enough, survive long enough to build something better. But 3 months ago, Richard had announced his engagement with a kind of joy that transformed his usually serious face into something boyish and unguarded. "I'm getting married," he had told Tracy one morning while she poured his coffee, his smile so wide it seemed his face could barely contain it. "Her name is Lucy. She's everything I've ever wanted." Lucy had arrived at the estate a week later in a silver car that purred like a contented cat, stepping out in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Tracy earned in a year. Her hair fell in perfect waves down her back, dark and glossy, and she wore gold earrings that caught the sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the driveway. Her perfume, something floral and expensive, announced her presence before she spoke, filling rooms with a scent that made Tracy's nose itch. She was beautiful in the way magazine covers were beautiful, flawless, polished, untouchable. Tracy had smiled and offered a greeting when Lucy first entered the house, a simple, "Good morning, ma'am." But Lucy's eyes had slid past her without acknowledgement, as if Tracy were transparent, as if the words had been spoken by the air itself. There was no cruelty in the dismissal. That would have required recognition, only a complete absence of awareness that Tracy existed as a person rather than a function. In the weeks that followed, Tracy noticed small things. How Lucy's laugh sounded different when Richard left the room, less musical and more mechanical. How her smile tightened when she thought no one was watching. How her eyes would glaze with boredom during Richard's stories, even as she nodded and touched his arm at appropriate moments. But Tracy rationalized these observations away. Lucy must be tired from the wedding planning, overwhelmed by all the decisions, adjusting to a new life. It was not Tracy's place to judge, not her role to question, not her right to suspect. The estate transformed into a whirlwind of preparation. Tailors arrived with fabric samples and measuring tapes. Florists filled the conservatory with arrangements of white roses and lilies. Caterers tested menu options in the kitchen, and a wedding planner with a clipboard barked orders at everyone. Tracy's workload doubled, then tripled. She polished silver until her reflection wavered in every fork and spoon, washed windows until the glass disappeared, scrubbed floors that would be covered with rose petals, ironed tablecloths that would be stained with wine. Her body began to fail in small ways. Her hands cramped around the scrub brush, her vision blurred from exhaustion, her legs wobbled when she climbed the attic stairs to her room. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her dresses hanging looser on a frame that was already too thin. But she said nothing. Because this was temporary, because the wedding would pass, because her mother needed the money and her brothers needed food, and survival meant endurance. Still, she watched. She could not help but watch. And in watching, she began to see the cracks in Lucy's performance. The way her hand would slip from Richard's when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she would check her phone with an urgency that had nothing to do with wedding planning, the way her voice would drop to a whisper when she made calls from the garden, pacing between the rose bushes with her back turned to the house. Tracy told herself it was nothing. She told herself to focus on her work, to keep her head down, to remember the invisible line she must never cross. She told herself that wealthy people were different, that their relationships operated by rules she could not understand, that it was not her place to wonder or worry or care. But deep in her chest, beneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the constant ache, something whispered that she should pay attention, that something was wrong, that the bright laughter and white roses and golden rings were hiding a darkness she could not yet name. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before the wedding, while Tracy was cleaning the upstairs hallway, she heard Lucy's voice drifting through the half-open door of the guest room. Tracy had been dusting the picture frames that lined the corridor, moving quietly as she always did, when she heard the voice. Lucy's voice, but different, stripped of the honeyed warmth she used with Richard, sharp and cold as winter glass. Tracy froze, her cloth suspended in mid-air, her breath caught in her throat. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had simply been doing her job, existing in her usual invisibility. But now the words poured through the doorway and she could not unhear them. "I don't love him, Marcus. God, you know I don't love him." Lucy's laugh was harsh, nothing like the musical sound she performed for Richard. "He's a fool, honestly. A sweet, naive fool with more money than sense. He actually believes I fell for his kindness and his generous heart." The mockery in her voice made Tracy's stomach turn. "The plan hasn't changed. I marry him. Wait exactly 18 months. Long enough that it doesn't look suspicious. Then I file for divorce. Ohio's alimony laws are beautiful, darling. With his assets and no prenup, I'll walk away with almost everything. Maybe everything if I play the heartbroken wife convincingly enough." There was a pause, presumably while the person named Marcus responded on the other end of the phone. Lucy continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. "Of course I'll be with you after. That's the whole point. We'll have enough money to do everything we've planned. The villa in Tuscany, the apartment in Manhattan, traveling wherever we want, without working another day in our lives. Richard's just the means to an end, sweetheart. He's funding our future and he doesn't even know it." Another pause. "No, he suspects nothing. Why would he? I've been perfect." I smile at his boring stories. I let him hold my hand. I pretend to care about his charity work and his investments. He's so desperate to be loved that he sees exactly what he wants to see. Men like him, they think money can buy them a perfect life, a perfect wife. They're so easy to deceive because they don't believe anyone would lie to them. Tracy's vision blurred at the edges, her hand gripping the picture frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she felt suddenly dizzy, as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet. This could not be real. She must have misunderstood. She must be imagining things, inventing betrayals where none existed, letting her exhaustion twist innocent words into nightmares. But Lucy's voice continued, each word landing like a stone. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. Then I just have to play house for 18 months. I can do anything for 18 months, if it means I never have to pretend again. God, I'm so tired of pretending to be charmed by his earnestness, of acting grateful for his little gifts, of faking affection I don't feel. But it'll be worth it, Marcus. Every second of pretending will be worth it when we're together with his money in our account." Tracy's entire body trembled. She wanted to move, to run, to unsee and unhear what she had just witnessed. But her feet were rooted to the floor. Her mind spun through the implications. Richard, who had been kind to her, who had given her work when she was desperate, who treated her like a human being rather than furniture, was walking into a trap. Lucy was going to marry him with lies on her lips and betrayal in her heart, was going to take his money and his trust and leave him broken. The weight of the knowledge crashed over Tracy like a wave. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound, turned slowly, carefully, and walked on trembling legs toward the attic stairs. In her small room beneath the slanted roof, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at her hands, at the calluses and wrinkles and evidence of years of hard work, and felt the impossible burden of what she now knew. "This cannot be true," she whispered to the empty room. But she had heard every word, every cruel, calculated word. That night, Tracy could not eat the small portion of bread and cheese she had saved from the kitchen. Her stomach churned with nausea, her appetite erased by the conversation replaying endlessly in her mind. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as moonlight moved across the roof tiles, and the moral weight of her knowledge pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She remembered Richard's face when he had announced his engagement. The pure, unguarded joy, the boyish excitement, the way his hands had trembled slightly when he showed her the ring he had chosen for Lucy. "Do you think she'll like it?" he had asked Tracy, as if her opinion mattered, as if she were someone whose judgment he valued. She had said yes, because the ring was beautiful, and because she had no reason then to believe Lucy was anything other than what she appeared to be. But now she knew the truth. Now she understood that Lucy's smiles were masks, that her affection was performance, that every touch and laugh and whispered endearment was calculated theater designed to rob a good man of his money and his faith in love itself. Tracy's mind spun through her options like a wheel that would not stop turning. If she spoke, who would believe her? She was a maid, poor, uneducated, insignificant. Lucy was beautiful and polished and belonged to Richard's world in a way Tracy never could. If Tracy told Richard what she had heard, he might think she was jealous or lying or trying to sabotage his happiness. Lucy would deny everything, would turn the accusation back on Tracy, would make her seem like a delusional servant with delusions. Tracy would lose her job. Without this job, her mother would have no medicine. Her brothers would go hungry. They would lose the apartment and end up on the streets. If she stayed silent, she would watch Richard marry a woman who saw him as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. She would serve them dinner, clean their home, witness the slow destruction of a man who had shown her kindness. She would be complicit in his betrayal, would carry the guilt of her silence for the rest of her life, would know that she could have saved him and chose safety instead. The choice was impossible. Both paths led to ruin. hers or his. Tracy did not sleep that night, or the night after. She moved through her days like a ghost, her hands performing their tasks, while her mind churned through scenarios and consequences. The other servants noticed. The cook asked if she was feeling ill. The gardener commented that she looked pale, but she offered weak smiles and mumbled excuses about a headache, about not sleeping well, about the stress of wedding preparations. She watched Richard and Lucy together, and now she could see what she had missed before: the performance. Lucy was brilliant at it, her hand on his arm at exactly the right moments, her laugh timed perfectly to his jokes, her eyes gazing at him with manufactured adoration. But when Richard turned away, Tracy saw Lucy's smile collapse like a puppet whose strings had been cut, saw her eyes go flat and bored, saw her check her phone with an urgency that had nothing to do with wedding planning. The days counted down: 14 days until the wedding, then 12, then 10. Tracy made mistakes she had never made before. She burned a pot of soup, dropped a crystal glass that shattered across the kitchen floor, forgot to replace the towels in the guest bathroom. Her hands shook when she held the scrub brush, and she would lose minutes staring at nothing, her mind trapped in the loop of that overheard conversation. "What's wrong with you?" the cook asked one afternoon, not unkindly. "You're not yourself." "I'm fine," Tracy lied, because what else could she say? "I know the bride is a liar and a thief, and I don't know what to do with this terrible knowledge." At night in her attic room, Tracy would take out the photograph of her mother, the only possession she treasured, and study her mother's face, worn and tired, but smiling despite everything. Her mother had taught her to be honest, to do what was right even when it was hard, to help those who needed help. But her mother had also taught her to be practical, to survive, to remember that noble gestures did not feed hungry children or pay for medicine. 7 days before the wedding, Tracy made her decision. She could not speak directly. That path led only to disbelief and retaliation. But she could warn Richard another way, could give him the information and let him decide what to do with it. She would write a letter, would tell him everything she had heard, would leave the choice in his hands. Tracy had never been good at writing. Her education had ended at 14, and spelling had always confused her, letters reversing themselves in her mind, words coming out wrong on paper. But this was too important for her inadequacy to matter. She waited until the house was silent, until Richard and Lucy had gone to dinner in downtown Columbus, until the other servants had retired to their rooms. In her attic room by candlelight, she could not risk the lamp drawing attention, Tracy found a piece of paper from the notepad Richard had given her months ago for making shopping lists. She sat at the small wooden desk she had found abandoned in the basement, smoothed the paper flat, and began to write. Her handwriting was cramped and uneven, her spelling uncertain, but she poured truth onto the page. "Dear Mr. Richard, I am writing to you because I heard something that you need to know. I did not mean to listen, but I was cleaning, and Miss Lucy was talking on the phone. She said she does not love you. She said she is going to marry you and then divorce you after 18 months to take your money. She said you are a fool and easy to deceive. She is in love with a man named Marcus, and they have a plan to take your money and leave together. She is pretending everything and using you. I am sorry to tell you this. I am afraid you will not believe me because I am just a maid. But I heard her say these things. Every word. She is not who she pretends to be. She is going to hurt you. Please be careful. Please don't marry her. You are a good man and you deserve Simone who loves you for real, from a friend who cares." Tracy's hands trembled as she wrote, smudging the ink in places, crossing out words and rewriting them. The candle flickered, throwing dancing shadows across the page. When she finished, she read it 3 times, checking for anything she had forgotten, any detail that might make the difference between belief and dismissal. She could not sign her name. That would make her too vulnerable, too easy to blame and punish. The anonymous warning might carry more weight anyway, might seem like it came from someone with no personal stake, no reason to lie. Tracy folded the letter carefully, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She tucked it into the pocket of her dress, where it felt like it was burning through the fabric directly into her skin. Now she had to decide where to hide it, where Richard would find it naturally, privately, in a way that would not raise suspicion. The jacket. Richard had a suit jacket hanging in his dressing room, the one he planned to wear the day before the wedding for the rehearsal dinner. Tracy had pressed it yesterday, had hung it carefully on the wooden valet stand. If she slipped the letter into the inner pocket, he would find it when he dressed, would have time to read it alone, to process the information, to decide what to do. Tracy waited until 3 in the morning, when even the night sounds of the house had settled into deep silence. She crept down the attic stairs, wincing at every creak, her heartbeat so loud she was certain it would wake someone. The house was dark except for moonlight filtering through windows, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Richard's dressing room door was unlocked. Tracy slipped inside, her breath shallow, her hands sweaty despite the cool night air. The suit jacket hung exactly where she had left it, dark fabric blending into darkness. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded letter, and with shaking fingers, slipped it into the inner breast pocket of the jacket. The paper rustled softly, impossibly loud in the silence. Tracy froze, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that someone had heard. Nothing. Only her own panicked breathing and the distant hoot of an owl outside. She withdrew her hand, stepped back, and stared at the jacket. The letter was hidden, invisible, waiting. Richard would find it tomorrow when he dressed for the rehearsal dinner. He would read her words, and then it would be in his hands, not hers. She had done what she could. Relief and terror washed over her in equal measure. Tracy backed out of the dressing room, closed the door with agonizing slowness, and fled back to her attic room. She climbed into bed, fully clothed, and pulled the thin blanket over her head, shivering despite the summer warmth. "It's done," she whispered into the darkness. "Now I wait." But waiting was its own special torture. The next day moved with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like taffy. Tracy went through her tasks mechanically, polishing the silver candlesticks that would grace the rehearsal dinner table, arranging flowers in crystal vases, preparing the guest rooms for Richard's relatives arriving from out of town. Her mind was elsewhere, constantly calculating. When would Richard dress? When would he find the letter? What would he do? She watched Lucy glide through the house, beautiful and false, chatting with the wedding planner about centerpieces and seating arrangements. Her performance flawless. Lucy touched Richard's shoulder as she passed him in the hallway, murmured something that made him smile, played her role without a single crack showing. Tracy saw what others didn't. The moment when Lucy's smile vanished, the instant Richard turned his back, the way she rolled her eyes when he suggested they take a walk together. The cold calculation in her gaze when she examined the wedding gifts arriving daily. The mask slipped constantly now, but only for those invisible enough to notice. And Tracy was the most invisible person in the house. Richard seemed happier than Tracy had ever seen him. He hummed while reading the newspaper, thanked the cook profusely for breakfast, stood at the window of his study gazing out at the garden with a soft smile. He was a man who believed himself loved, who believed his future was bright, who trusted completely in the woman he had chosen. Tracy's chest ached watching him. In 6 hours he would find the letter. In 6 hours, his world would either shatter or he would dismiss her warning as nonsense. She had no way to know which, no way to prepare for the aftermath. The afternoon crept toward evening. Guests began arriving for the rehearsal dinner. Richard's uncle from Cleveland, his college roommate from Cincinnati, Lucy's parents with their expensive luggage and entitled demands. The house filled with voices and laughter, and Tracy moved among them like a shadow, carrying trays of drinks, taking coats, existing at the periphery of other people's joy. At 6 o'clock, Richard excused himself to dress for dinner. Tracy was in the dining room setting out the china when he climbed the stairs to his room. Her hands froze mid-motion, a plate suspended over the table. This was it. He was going to his dressing room. He was going to put on the jacket. He was going to find the letter. Time became strange, simultaneously racing and frozen. Tracy forced herself to continue working, to lay out forks and knives, to fold napkins, to light candles. She could not go upstairs. She could not check. She could only wait and wonder and pray. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. Then faintly, Tracy heard a sound from upstairs. Not a shout, not a crash, but something worse. Silence. The kind of silence that followed devastating news. The kind of silence that meant someone's world had just stopped turning. Tracy's hands trembled so badly she had to set down the water glasses before she dropped them. She stood frozen in the dining room, staring at the ceiling as if she could see through it to Richard's room, to whatever was happening in that moment. Footsteps. Slow footsteps descending the stairs. Tracy busied herself with straightening napkins that were already straight, her heart hammering. Richard appeared in the doorway of the dining room. He was dressed in the suit, the jacket properly buttoned, his hair combed, but his face had changed. The joy was gone, replaced by something hollow and shocked. His eyes were red, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked at Tracy, really looked at her. And in that moment, she knew. He had read the letter, and he believed it. Their eyes met across the room. No words passed between them, but everything was communicated in that single look. Acknowledgement, devastation, gratitude, pain. Richard's throat worked as if he might speak, but then he turned away and walked toward the sitting room where the guests were gathering. Tracy exhaled shakily and pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart trying to escape through her ribs. He knew. He knew everything. And now she could only wait to see what he would do with the truth. The rehearsal dinner began with champagne toasts and laughter that rang false to Tracy's ears, now that she knew what Richard knew. The guests settled around the long dining table, 12 people in total, including Richard and Lucy, and Tracy served the first course with hands that barely shook, though, inside, she was screaming. Lucy sat at Richard's right hand, radiant in a cream-colored dress, her dark hair swept up to reveal her elegant neck. She touched Richard's arm frequently, leaned close to whisper in his ear, played the devoted bride-to-be with the skill of a trained actress. If she noticed anything different in Richard's demeanor, she gave no sign. But Tracy noticed. Richard smiled when appropriate, nodded at his uncle's stories, raised his glass to return toasts, but his eyes were distant, his laughter hollow. He was performing now, too, matching Lucy's theater with his own, and Tracy wondered how long he could maintain the facade. When and how he would choose to reveal what he knew. The meal progressed through course after course: soup, salad, roasted duck, glazed vegetables, wine that cost more per bottle than Tracy earned in a month. Tracy moved around the table, refilling glasses, clearing plates, existing in her familiar invisibility while watching the tension build in Richard's shoulders, in the tightness around his mouth, in the way his hand gripped his wine glass a little too hard. Lucy was in the middle of a story about where they planned a honeymoon. Richard wanted the Alps, but I convinced him that the Mediterranean would be more romantic. When Richard set down his glass, with enough force that the crystal rang like a bell. The table fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. "Lucy," Richard said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Tracy's breath catch. "May I speak with you privately, for a moment?" Lucy's smile flickered, just for an instant, a micro-expression of uncertainty, before she recovered. "Of course, darling. But can it wait until after dinner? Your uncle was just about to tell us about—" "Now," Richard interrupted, standing from his chair. "Please." The word please was a formality that barely concealed the steel beneath. Lucy's face went pale, but she maintained her composure, laughing lightly as she stood. "Well, this sounds serious. I hope I'm not in trouble." She directed this to the table, inviting them to share in the joke, but no one laughed. Richard walked toward his study and Lucy followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Tracy, clearing plates near the doorway, heard Richard say quietly, "Close the door." The study door closed with a soft click. The dining room erupted in uncomfortable whispers. "What was that about?" "Do you think they had a fight?" "Pre-wedding jitters." "Probably." But Tracy excused herself to the kitchen, her legs barely supporting her weight. She did not know what was happening in that room, but she could imagine it. Richard confronting Lucy with the contents of the letter, Lucy denying everything, the truth hanging between them like a blade. 5 minutes passed. 10. The guests in the dining room grew restless, their conversation forced and awkward. Tracy stood in the kitchen doorway, gripping the frame, waiting. Then the study door opened. Richard emerged first, his face pale but composed, his jaw set. Behind him, Lucy stumbled slightly, her face drained a cour. Her perfect composure shattered. Her eyes were wide with shock, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that would not come. Richard walked directly to the dining room. The table fell silent instantly. He stood at the head of the table, placed his hands flat on the white tablecloth, and said in a voice that did not waver, "The wedding is canceled. Lucy and I will not be getting married." Gasps erupted around the table. Lucy's mother half rose from her chair. "What? Richard, what are you talking about? What happened?" "I've learned information that makes it impossible for me to marry Lucy," Richard said calmly. "I won't go into details out of respect for everyone here, but my decision is final. I apologize for the inconvenience this causes, and I'll cover any costs that have been incurred. But there will be no wedding." Lucy appeared in the doorway behind him, her face a mask of desperate panic. "Richard, please, let's talk about this. Whatever you think you know." "I know everything," Richard said, not even turning to look at her. "I verified it. Called my banker, checked records, made calls. The man named Marcus sends his regards, by the way." Lucy's face went from pale to ashen. Her mouth worked silently, and for the first time since Tracy had met her, the beautiful, polished woman looked utterly human. Terrified. Exposed. Caught. "I don't know what lies someone has told you." Lucy tried again, her voice rising toward hysteria. "But you can't seriously believe—" "I believe my own eyes and ears," Richard interrupted. "I believe phone records and financial statements. I believe the truth when it's presented to me, even when it's painful." He finally turned to look at her, and his gaze was not angry, but sad. Infinitely sad. "You're very good at pretending, Lucy. You almost had me convinced. But it's over now." The silence in the dining room was absolute. Lucy stood frozen in the doorway, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Her mother spoke first, her voice sharp. "Lucy, what is he talking about? What have you done?" Lucy's eyes darted around the room, landing on each face, finding no sympathy, no support, only shock and dawning understanding. The mask had shattered completely, and underneath was someone Tracy barely recognized, smaller somehow, ordinary, afraid. Lucy started, but nothing followed. What could she say? What explanation would make sense? Richard knew about Marcus, knew about the plan, knew about the 18 months and the alimony and the villa in Tuscany. He knew everything. "I think it's best if you leave," Richard said quietly. "Tonight. Now." "Richard, please." Lucy's voice broke, and Tracy could not tell if the tears forming in her eyes were genuine or one last performance, one final attempt at manipulation. "Now," Richard repeated, and this time there was no softness in his voice, only finality. Lucy's father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Come, Lucy. We're going." His voice was tight with humiliation and anger. Whether at his daughter or at Richard, Tracy could not tell. Lucy walked through the dining room on unsteady legs, her mother following with a face like carved stone. At the doorway, Lucy turned back one last time, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She looked at Richard with something that might have been regret or might have been fury at being caught. And then she was gone, her heels clicking rapidly down the hall, the front door opening and closing, a car engine starting in the driveway. The guests sat in stunned silence. Richard's uncle cleared his throat. "Richard, son, are you all right?" Richard sank into his chair as if his legs would no longer hold him. "No," he said honestly, "but I will be." He looked around the table at his family and friends. These people who had come to celebrate what they thought would be a joyful union. "I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. Please, stay as long as you'd like. The rooms are prepared, but I need some time alone." He stood again, swaying slightly, and walked out of the dining room. Tracy heard his footsteps ascending the stairs, heard a door close somewhere above. The guests began gathering their things, speaking in hushed, uncomfortable tones, deciding whether to stay the night or find hotels in Columbus, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Tracy retreated to the kitchen, her whole body shaking with relief and residual fear. She had done it, she had warned him, and he had believed her, and he had saved himself from a marriage built on lies and greed. But the cost, watching his joy crumble, seeing him walk away with that devastated look in his eyes, felt almost too heavy to bear. The other servants whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened, but Tracy said nothing. She cleaned the abandoned dinner plates, scraped uneaten food into the trash, washed crystal glasses with trembling hands. The house slowly emptied as guests departed with awkward goodbyes and promises to check on Richard tomorrow. By midnight, the estate was silent again. Tracy finished her work in the kitchen and climbed the stairs to her attic room, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She had just changed into her nightgown when she heard a soft knock on her door. Her heart stopped. No one ever came to her room. She opened the door slowly and found Richard standing in the hallway, still in his suit, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes clear. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Tracy stepped back, suddenly acutely aware of how small and bare her room was. The narrow bed, the single chair, the cracked mirror, the photograph of her mother tacked to the wall. Richard had never been up here, had never seen how his servants lived. He looked around the room, taking in the poverty of it, and something in his expression shifted. Shame, perhaps, or recognition. Then his eyes landed on Tracy, and he pulled the folded letter from his pocket. "You wrote this," he said. Not a question. A statement. Tracy's throat closed. She wanted to lie to protect herself, but she could not. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "How did you know?" Richard asked. "I heard her," Tracy whispered. 2 weeks ago. I was cleaning upstairs and she was in the guest room talking on the phone. I didn't mean to listen, I swear, I was just working, but I heard her say terrible things. About you. About her plan. About Marcus." The words tumbled out in a rush, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Richard. I know it wasn't my place. I know I should have stayed silent, but I couldn't let her hurt you. You've been kind to me, and you didn't deserve what she was planning." Richard stood very still, and Tracy could not read his expression. Her mind raced with possibilities. He was angry that she had eavesdropped, angry that she had interfered, angry that she had destroyed his happiness, even if that happiness was built on lies. Then Richard did something Tracy had never expected. He pulled out the wooden chair and sat down heavily, his shoulders sagging. "I'm not angry," he said, reading her fear. "I'm grateful and devastated. And grateful again." He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Do you know what would have happened if you hadn't told me? I would have married her, given her access to everything. And in 18 months, she would have left me bankrupt and broken. And I would have never understood why." His voice cracked. "You saved me from that, Tracy." Tracy's tears spilled over. "I was so scared you wouldn't believe me. I thought you'd think I was lying or jealous or trying to hurt you. I almost didn't tell you. I almost stayed silent." "Why didn't you?" Richard asked. "You risked your job, your safety. If Lucy had found out, if I had chosen not to believe you, you would have lost everything. Why did you risk that for me?" Tracy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "My mother taught me to help people when they need help, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. You're a good person, Mr. Richard. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you have. And I couldn't watch her destroy you and do nothing." Richard covered his face with his hands, and his shoulders shook. For a moment Tracy thought he was crying, but when he lowered his hands he was smiling. A sad, broken smile, but real. "Do you know how rare that is? Real honesty? Real courage?" He shook his head in wonder. "You have more integrity in your smallest finger than Lucy had in her entire body." He stood, and Tracy instinctively stepped back, but Richard simply placed his hand on her shoulder, a touch that was gentle and respectful and full of gratitude. "You will never worry about money again," he said firmly. "Your mother will have the best medical care. Your brothers will go to the best schools, and you—" He looked around the tiny attic room again. "You will never sleep in a place like this again. I'm going to make sure you have opportunities, education, a real future. You risked everything for me. I can do no less for you." Tracy shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't need anything, Mr. Richard. I just wanted you to be safe." "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly why you deserve everything." He walked to the door, then paused and turned back. "Thank you, Tracy. You gave me the truth when everyone else would have stayed silent. You have more courage than anyone I've ever known." After he left, Tracy sat on her bed for a long time, staring at her hands. The hands that had scrubbed floors and written a letter that changed everything. She felt lighter, somehow, as if a weight she had been carrying for weeks had finally been lifted. She had done the right thing. It had been terrifying and dangerous and had nearly cost her everything, but she had done it anyway. And somehow, impossibly, it had turned out all right. The days that followed were strange and quiet. The wedding decorations came down, the flowers were donated to the local hospital, the guests departed with awkward sympathy. Richard moved through the house like a man waking from a long sleep, processing his grief privately, grateful to have discovered the truth before it was too late. Tracy returned to her work, but things had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Richard spoke to her differently now, not as a servant, but as a person he respected, someone whose opinion mattered. He asked about her family, remembered her brothers' names, inquired about her mother's health. 2 weeks after the canceled wedding, Richard called Tracy to his study. She entered nervously, still expecting punishment despite everything, still conditioned to fear being noticed. Richard gestured to a chair, an invitation Tracy had never received before. Hesitantly, she sat. "I've been thinking," Richard said, leaning back in his own chair, "about what you did for me. About the kind of person who would risk everything to help someone else. And I've made some decisions." He slid an envelope across the desk. Tracy opened it with shaking hands and found a check. More money than she earned in a year, in 2 years. Enough to pay for her mother's surgery and her brother's school and rent for months to come. "That's not charity," Richard said before she could protest. "That's a bonus for years of loyal service and for saving me from the biggest mistake of my life. But there's more." He pulled out another document. "I've arranged for your mother to be transferred to the best pulmonary specialist in Ohio. All costs covered. I've also enrolled your brothers in a private school with full scholarships. Arranged by me. But they'll never know unless you tell them. And I'd like to send you to school as well if you're interested. Business courses, accounting, whatever you want to learn. You're smart, Tracy. You deserve a chance to do more than scrub floors." Tracy's vision blurred with tears. "Mr. Richard, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard replied simply. "Let me do this. Let me help you the way you helped me." Tracy nodded, unable to speak, gratitude overwhelming her, sir. Over the following months, Tracy's life transformed in ways she had never dared imagine. Her mother underwent surgery that saved her life, breathing easier than she had in years. Her brothers thrived in their new school, discovering talents they'd never had the opportunity to explore before. And Tracy herself began taking evening classes in business administration, discovering she had a mind for numbers and strategy that surprised even her. She still worked at Richard's estate, not as a maid, but as his household manager, overseeing staff and budgets with a newfound confidence. Richard treated her as a trusted colleague, someone whose judgment he valued, someone whose courage he admired. Richard himself slowly healed from the betrayal, grew wiser and more cautious, but not bitter. He learned to value honesty over performance, substance over surface, and he often told Tracy that she had taught him the most important lesson of his life. That true character reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments when no one is watching, when the cost of doing right is highest and the reward uncertain. The estate in Minerva Park became a gentler place. The roses bloomed brighter somehow, or perhaps Tracy was simply able to notice them now that fear and exhaustion no longer consumed her every waking moment. Children's laughter sometimes drifted through the halls when her brothers visited on weekends, and Richard would smile at the sound, grateful for the noise, for the life, for the reminder that trust and goodness still existed in the world. On quiet evenings, Tracy would sit in the garden with a book from Richard's library, and she would remember the girl she had been, terrified, exhausted, invisible, and marvel at how far she had come. She thought of the letter written by candlelight with trembling hands, the terrible risk she had taken, the moment when she had chosen courage over safety. She thought of Lucy sometimes, too, wondering where the woman had gone, whether she had learned anything from being exposed, whether Marcus had stayed with her once the money was no longer coming. But mostly, Tracy thought about the simple truth that had guided her. Doing the right thing was often the hardest thing, but it was the only thing that allowed you to live with yourself afterward. Richard eventually found love again, real love this time, with a woman who valued him for his kindness rather than his bank account, someone who treated his staff with respect and smiled at Tracy like a friend rather than looking through her like glass. The wedding was small and genuine, filled with laughter that didn't sound like performance, and Tracy stood among the guests as someone who belonged, someone who mattered, someone who had earned her place through courage and integrity. In the end, it was not wealth or power or beauty that had triumphed in this story, but truth. It was not grand declarations or public heroism that had saved Richard, but a quiet act of conscience by someone the world had taught to stay silent. Tracy had been just a maid with calloused hands and a worn dress, but she had chosen honesty over fear, had chosen to protect someone who could not protect himself, had chosen to risk everything for what was right. And in that choice, she had proven that courage does not belong only to the powerful, that the smallest voice can speak the most important truth, and that the heart willing to sacrifice for others will always find light, no matter how deep the darkness. This is Fortune Tales by Simple.